Today on episode 124 of Teaching in Higher Ed, Maha Bali talks about intercultural learning. Produced by Innovate Learning, maximizing human potential. Welcome to this episode of Teaching in Higher Ed. I'm Bonnie Stahoviak, and this is the space where we explore the art and science of being more effective at facilitating learning. We also share ways to increase our personal productivity so we can have more peace in our lives, which allows us to be even more present for our students. I'm thrilled to be welcoming back to the show today Dr. Maha Bali, and she was on episode 108 talking about collaboration, and today she's going to be joining me talking about intercultural learning. She is an associate professor of practice at the Center for Learning and Teaching at the American University in Cairo. She's a full-time faculty developer, and she also teaches creative educational game design to undergrads. She is co-founder of virtuallyconnecting.org, co-founder and co-facilitator of Ed Contexts, and editor at her favorite journal, Hybrid Pedagogy, and blogger at Prof Hacker. She's also international director of Digital Pedagogy Lab. In a nutshell, she is a self-described learnaholic, writeaholic, and passionate, open, and connected educator. Welcome back to the show, Maha.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be back talking to you.
You and I are funny on Twitter because I never calculate what time it is in Egypt, but I do know that you're known for late nights and early mornings and everything in between. But we got into some good Twitter conversation around the issue of intercultural learning. And I'm so glad that you were willing to come back on and talk a little bit about this.
I'm really happy to be back. And this is one of my favorite topics. And like I was just telling you this morning, it's been one of those, not this morning, like starting this morning until now, it's 11 p.m. now. This has been a topic of the day, so I'm really, really ready for it. So.
Oh, good. Well, you were so gracious to send me your thesis, and I was sharing with you that things have been a little busy in our household here. And so I literally could have not just read the section of your thesis, but I wanted to read the whole entire thing. It's fascinating. And would you just share a little bit about the broad thesis topic and then the topic that we're going to be sharing about today?
Right. So my thesis in general, about the development of critical thinking for students at my institution. And what I did is, I interviewed students who had some level of critical thinking based on what I knew teaching them. And then whatever themes came out of there, I developed further by interviewing faculty and staff and reflecting on my own experiences and doing all kinds of other kinds of research. And then I just came up with like 4 broad areas that develop critical thinking in the context of AUC, which is where I am. And one of the chapters is about intercultural learning. And that's actually the last one I talk about, because the institution I'm at is already bicultural. It's an American institution in Egypt. So that's already a bicultural institution just in its own identity. But there's also a lot of opportunities for intercultural learning that students identified as helping them learn. And I just got really into it as I was doing that part of my thesis, researching intercultural learning in a lot of depth. In itself, it's very connected to critical thinking, right? But it's also a thing on its own. And so I'm still fascinated by it until now. So I'm really happy to be talking about it with someone.
I have read a couple of books about critical thinking before, but by no means am an expert after the two books. I will say though, and actually we had a guest come on and talk about critical thinking, and it's been one of the most popular episodes. So I know it's something that a lot of us in higher ed want to help develop in our students. And of course, we've had lots of conversations about diversity and about cultural competence, but this is the first time it's coming together. And for you, it sounds like that was more second nature. But for me, I thought, well, of course these things do go together. And that is some of the problems is when we have less maturity in our cultural competence. Some of that is, of course, due to a lack of critical thinking, but I just hadn't put it together like that. So I'm so excited about today's conversation.
It's a chicken and egg thing.
Yeah.
As I was just telling you before, it's like the more you're exposed, the more critical you are, but then you need to be a little bit critical to allow yourself to be properly exposed, to be open to listening to different viewpoints and so on. I will talk about this a little bit more as we go.
Yeah, I was mentioning to you how accessible the writing style was to me, and how much I dove right in, and I thought I was going to have a harder time with it and started to get nervous. Oh no, am I going to have enough time to prepare to make best use of your expertise on this? And I was excited just at how rich it is, but also how your writing just makes it accessible for all different types. You're not trying to, highbrow it with making it inaccessible to people. I really appreciated that. And there were things that really stood out to me. I've got, you see it all printed out with all these highlights and stars and everything. And I wanted to read just one quote.
Oh, I got stars?
Yeah, there's stars.
Are they gold stars?
Well, I only had a blue pen, so they're blue stars. I'm going to read this quote, and then I know there's one that you really meant a lot to you as well. And this is from a 2001 source. I'm not sure if I'll pronounce it right. Byram.
I don't know how to pronounce it either. Okay. Barometal, yeah, I guess. And
just so people know, we'll have all of the references that we refer to in the show notes so that people can access them and learn even more. And also, of course, to your thesis as well, if you're open to that.
Oh, sure. It's open access.
Yeah, I thought so.
Of course.
So here's the quote. "It is not the purpose of teaching to try to change learners' values, but to make them explicit and conscious in any evaluative response to others. There is nonetheless a fundamental values proposition, position, which acknowledges respect for human dignity and equality of human rights as the democratic basis for social interaction." I love that. It reminds me of they talk about making sure there's a diversity statement in your syllabus of some kind. And I think that's my diversity statement, that we can all express different points of views, and I'm not going to try to change your values, but there is just this whole idea of it does come down to human dignity and equality of human rights as the democratic basis for social interaction. I love that one. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and we were just talking earlier, for you, this is one of your favorite quotes. And I was saying my favorite quote is just one in the page before it. Mm-hmm. But I also get what you're saying about the part about emphasizing sort of the purpose of why you're doing it, and the respect for human dignity and equality and human rights as the purpose of why you're doing it. But you don't do it by trying to change learners' values, but by making them explicit. The one that I like more is a quote by Bakhtin, who's a Russian scholar. It's a 1961 quote. And I have one of his books, but I've never gotten around to reading it because it's so hard to read. But the quote, which I love, is he says, "I am conscious of myself and become myself only while revealing myself for another, through another, and with the help of another." And so that one is maybe a more personal one, and it talks about how you get to know yourself better as you interact with other people, and as you interact with people probably, it doesn't say that, but I think also different from yourself, who help you question, not necessarily by directly questioning you, but just by being different and by spending a lot of time with people who are different than yourself, you start to sort of get to know yourself even better. And I was just talking to you just before we went on air about when you leave your culture and go to live somewhere else, and how that helps you question your own values and what you've been taking for granted and your assumptions. It can be obviously a stage of disequilibrium, right? And it can be very disturbing, but it can also be very enriching and a great time for growth and development.
Talk a little bit more about that, what opportunities our students have to learn as they are exposed more to theory, and then some of the limitations of theory as it comes to our own intercultural learning.
Right. So, I mean, it's the problem with being exposed to theory is that you have this distance from whatever it is you're reading about, and it's so abstract that you get what it means in theory, but you don't really get what it means to actually live it in practice, or to see it happening, or to interact with someone who has to deal with I'm thinking indignities, I think, of a certain kind. So for example, just today, Paul Prinsloo shared on Twitter an article about what it means to travel with an African passport, and what happens to you in the airport, and the indignities of asking for a visa and being refused entry to certain countries, and being placed in a certain place where I think the guy called us Africans. He said passport undesirables, I think, something like that.
Yeah.
And yeah, if you're American or European, it's very easy for you to get anywhere. And if you are Arab or African, it's actually pretty difficult for you to get pretty much anywhere, even nearby countries. Like people are just... And the thing is that I've heard Americans laugh or joke about maybe not being able to get into Egypt because they're American, and it really makes me angry because it's not funny. You really don't have problems getting into this country, you know what I mean? But if you've seen the way someone like me gets randomly checked 50% of the time at an airport, if you traveled with me often enough and you saw how often I get chosen for a random check and you saw how the people, you know what I mean? If you see that, if you have a close enough relationship with someone who's like that, and you see it, it's completely different than hearing about it. And it's, thinking it just happens like every now and then, or maybe it's just that one person's experience. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And of course, even if I did travel often with you and I was able to observe that happening to you, it still is not the same thing as it happening to me.
Right. And I was thinking of people who have very, very close relationships to someone of a different culture, like they're married to someone from a different culture, for example. They're obviously, well, there are two things, right? They had to be originally culturally sensitive in some way to be open to having that kind of relationship with someone so different from them, right? But also they develop it more by their interaction with that person and their family and so on. And then when they have children, then it becomes even a bigger issue. And they're still who they are. They're still not that person, but they have a better experience of that different culture than if they had been just, themselves marrying someone of a very similar culture. And there's, and I think maybe that what I'm going to say now is probably not necessarily in the part you were reading, but there's this thing about people who immigrate to a new country and whether they assimilate or integrate or do something different. And so whether they assimilate and just become like the new culture, or whether they separate and remain, like try to hold on to their own culture, and whether they try to find something in between where they can maintain elements of their own identity but still be able to interact well with others. And that's talking about people who are immigrants going into another place, but also it's really important to think about us and how we welcome new people into our own culture, whether it's even your company or your department, not necessarily your entire country, and whether we're asking them to be more exactly like us if they want to fit in. Do they have to have whatever kind of values we have to be able to interact with us? Or do we encourage them to remain their own selves, and do we give them a way to stay themselves but still, integrate with us?
Yeah. One of the things you talk about is the impact of intercultural experiences on students' critical thinking, and through some of the interviews that you did, how it helped them recognize and understand different worldviews. And then the next thing you said was recognize their own personal biases. Because one of the things I think can be a challenge is when, either if we're doing this ourselves, reading about other people's experiences, or as you said, sharing the theory with our students, that so often it can just sound like we're talking about somebody else. Oh, yeah. Those people that have those biases, well, shame on them. If only they would stop having those biases. But where, and maybe this actually starts to put us on the part of the conversation about this being a continuum, because I first have to recognize that I have biases, that it's not just those other people that do, but that they are in me, and that probably I can never rid myself of them completely. And in fact, some of our biases actually help us stay safe. I mean, that's how we've been able to survive through generations. But that is a part of the process, is to recognize, oh, I have these biases. And I thought that was a nice one. Do you want to talk a little bit now about the continuum, that it's not just binary?
So, I mean, the first one, that just, this thinking between the difference between theory and practice, I was thinking that maybe the King, Baxter, Magolda model, it's called the developmental model of intercultural maturity. Mm-hmm. And what I like about it is that it's not just a spectrum, but it's also multidimensional. So it talks about a cognitive aspect, an intrapersonal, so metacognitive aspect, and an interpersonal aspect. And the thing is, if you just read about the theory, then maybe you're developing your cognitive aspect of it, like just sort of knowing that there are different worldviews out there and understanding the history of them or whatever. But you just knowing them doesn't mean that when you come to interact with someone who's different from yourself, that you're necessarily going to be able to do it well. So, just knowing something doesn't mean that you're not going to say something stupid to someone or something insensitive when you're dealing with them. And then there's also the metacognitive dimension, which is questioning yourself. And I think, again, learning theory doesn't necessarily make you question your biases in the same way that engaging with another person may challenge your viewpoints.
Yeah.
Because you have a lot of choice over how deeply to question yourself if there isn't a person in front of you who's really, urgently asking you to do that or making you do that. Or that you need to change your behavior like right now if you need to, and go back and think about why you're doing it. But even within each of these, there's a spectrum of where, how far you can be in each of these. So for example, sometimes when you're first exposed to something, I can't remember which model does that, but they say sometimes when you're first exposed to something, you get this exoticism of something else can make you at first either really, really impressed or really, really resistant to learning the other thing. And eventually you start to sort of see the different dimensions of it. So for example, there was a student of mine who did an internship in the US for like maybe a month or two, and she came back so impressed that everything in the States is wow, and they're so nice, and they're so open, and they're so open to diversity and so on. And I lived in the States for a whole year, and I didn't face a lot of discrimination in Houston. And I was just talking to someone about this today that, Houston, Texas, and everyone told me to expect a lot of discrimination, and there wasn't a lot of it, but there was a little bit of it, and to say that, oh, everything was wow, is just because you had a short experience there. But then you need to be really, really, you need to look a lot more closely and engage a lot more deeply with another culture to start seeing it in all of its, from different angles, and not just see the part that's really impressive, or just see the parts that's making you resistant. So just a very quick one about the resistance is, for example, the first time I only had this once actually, but the first time I had a student come to my class who had her face covered. It used to be not allowed on my campus, but for some reason they allowed it. And so I had a student whose face was covered. I couldn't see her face at all. And my first impression was like, oh my God, how am I going to deal with this person? And how am I going to know what she's thinking? And how's she going to respond in my class? And I was very resistant to it. But then with interacting with her over a long period of time, I just started to see her as a full person with, the whole person with all the different angles to her. And I learned how to deal with her even though I couldn't see her face, and to sort of know what she's feeling and thinking. And you'd think this is not really possible, but it is. You can tell a lot by just a person's eyes and their posture and all that. And so I think the point is, though, that you need, deep, sustained interaction with a person or a group of people to be able to understand that culture. It's not something that just getting exposed to for a very short period of time when you're traveling on a trip that you could do that. I mean, you can be on a trip and do all the touristy things and not learn anything, or you can try to engage deeply with people in public transportation, or you could try to engage deeply with even the people at your hotel, because you can see them every day, right? It's not going to be just like on a bus trip. But you can also try to maintain relationships with people different from yourself online, and even though you're not living their lives, you get to know a lot about them. And I know that I know a lot about a lot of other people that I've only met online just by this sustained interaction. They know when it's Ramadan here, and they know why my sleep is like that for that month.
I was familiar with Ramadan before, but there was another holiday that recently happened that you made me familiar with. Of course, now I can't think of what it was, but I went and looked it up to have a better appreciation for your culture. Yeah, that's always helpful. It's amazing what we can find out about each other. I was going to mention a children's book. I bought a book, I think it's called Hannah's Ears, but I will make sure that I have the title right and get that in the show notes. But it's about a young girl who has really, really big ears, and they all make fun of her, and she's very lonely, and she goes out into nature and feels alone, and she meets a tree, and the tree is also very lonely because the tree's friends have all been chopped down. And so the tree starts to tell her the stories of, and because she has such large ears, she's able to hear the tree's voice and stories. Aww. And the tree says, because you understand me and you have heard my stories, you can be the one to go back into the city and tell the other people what's happening so they can help rescue me and bring friends. And she goes back and tells the story to the mayor and the different townspeople. And as they listen, their ears get bigger too. As you were talking, it sort of reminded me of that, because you sort of think like, oh, either they'll stop making fun of her for having big ears and everyone will live happily ever after, or, but I didn't expect that the end of that story would be that everyone else also got those same large ears. They're better able to hear, better to empathize. Yeah, it's a beautiful story.
Do you know what I like about that story? Is that it's a reversal of standards. Mm-hmm. It makes big ears a good thing.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I love that story.
And I only found it because our daughter's name is Hannah. And so I had been on Amazon just looking at books that have the word Hannah in the title. I happened upon it. It's a really great book. Yeah. Talk a little bit about these stages. You started to wind us through them, but one of them is the issue of minimizing and trivializing the others.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about that phase?
So this is the Hammer et al. Model, right? And it's called the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. And so this is similar to what I was saying earlier, which is there's a part where there's a reversal where you're very impressed or whatever. Mm-hmm. There's a part where you're defensive about your own culture versus others. And then there's this part where you minimize the differences between different cultures and just romanticize the other as we're all human and all that, which is a good stage to be. I mean, it's better than looking at the other person as an alien, right?
Yeah.
That's why we're saying it's a spectrum, and there is a stage where that's the case, and it's not bad. I mean, there's a song in the Lion Guard. It's called Sisi Nisawa. I'm not sure what language that is. Some African language that they're tokenizing, I guess. But it means we're the same, and it's about lions and hyenas saying they're the same, even though lions and hyenas are known in nature not to really be good friends, but that they're actually the same in a lot of things, and they are, but they're also different in a lot of things, right? Mm. And so there's this model has ethnocentric stages and ethno-relative stages, and as you move into the ethno-relative stages, you start to accept that there are multiple viable worldviews, and that's the point. It's just not to know that there are different worldviews and that's it, but to respect that these are all viable, that there are these different ways of seeing something, and then possibly incorporating some of these different worldviews in your own thinking and behavior. And then finally, integration, where you become able to move between different cultures and worldviews. And two people who are really good at representing that is someone called Homi Bhabha, who writes about the notion of cultural hybridity and third space. And he talks about how, in a lot of colonial cultures, they're thinking about the pure pre-colonial Egyptian or Indian or whatever, but actually none of us are pure that way, and we're all cultural hybrids. And then when I interact with you, we're meeting in somewhere in between my culture and yours, that we can sort of meet somewhere in between that we can both use. So I have to speak in English for you to understand me. And when I speak in English, I express myself in a certain way. But you're also coming one step. I mean, maybe I'm taking 10 steps to get to you and you're taking one step towards me, but we're still meeting somewhere. That's not your culture or mine, but somewhere in between them. Mm. And so he calls that, he says each of us is a hybrid, but also we meet in between our cultures. And Edward Said is someone who, I don't know if he's most known for his work on Orientalism, but he's done a lot more than just that. But he talks about the notion of world travelers and about, if you're educated well enough and exposed well enough to different cultures, you're able to act as a free agent in all these different cultures and be that different person, and he himself, he's a Christian Palestinian who grew up in Egypt and then went to the U.S. And he has all these different dimensions to his own identity, and he belongs in all of them. You know what I mean? He doesn't belong to one, because when you're that kind of very hybrid person, you don't actually belong to any of them in any pure sense. And being that, I think a lot of definitely people who intermarry or people who live for a long time in a culture different than their own become like that, and they're a third culture or a fourth culture or whatever. Not necessarily something to aspire to if you're not in a situation where you can develop it, but I think definitely helpful to be able to sort of try to at least incorporate some different worldviews. So I find it very interesting when a Western person has very, very, Buddhist values or, something that you wouldn't normally expect to find in a Western person, Like just today, I was pretty angry at something, and I wrote a blog post, and someone responded to that blog post, and I think she's just English. She looks just English. I mean, I don't know her very well, but she's English, and she shared with me someone written by a Vietnamese woman whose name I don't know how to pronounce properly, but I'll put that in the show notes as one of the recommendations. And she's a Vietnamese woman, and she has a book called Woman Native Other. And she's trying to describe herself that way. And the thing is that, the person who wrote that read her book and she's influenced by her and everything, but she's a white English woman, I was not expecting that person to give me that reference. And that reference represented how I was feeling about myself as, Egyptian, Muslim, other. That was how I was feeling in that post. And she felt that, and she made that connection, and she gave it to me. You know what I mean? And so that sort of made me feel like she has a lot of intercultural sensitivity in doing that. And so that she got from reading. So that was interesting.
It's so nice when we can find someone else that can give something a voice that we have been feeling. Yeah.
Definitely.
Let's talk a little bit more about the classroom, because of course, it sounds like both you and I are in full agreement how rich it can be for our students to get a deep dive into intercultural experiences where they actually travel to another place and have that sense of loneliness, but also the opportunity for learning that they can embrace. What about right here in our classrooms, because we're not traveling too far to get to them? How do we increase those opportunities and think about moving people along this continuum from wherever they are, just moving them along a little bit?
Right. So I mean, the first question is, of course, not all campuses are the same. So some campuses will have more diversity in the classroom than others. In my campus, for example, you're not going to find international students in your mechanical engineering class. And so, and also not a professor who wants to talk about that kind of thing. But you find a few in other contexts. So, but in some campuses, you'll find people who look like they're all the same, but they might have different histories or, come from in America, especially, you'll have a lot of people who are immigrants from wherever. But even in Egypt, you'll find people who have lived somewhere else, like trying to bring out whatever elements of difference we have in the class and trying to see if people are willing to talk about that and bring that up and make it part of our identities. Like one of the things I do in my classes is ask my students to do an alternative CV at the beginning of the class. This was an activity we developed for Digital Writing Month, and it's about presenting yourself, not with what degrees you have or whatever that you do for a regular CV, but how you want people to know you. And I don't specify what students need to say. And some of them say a lot of really interesting things about themselves and reveal those things about themselves, and it makes a difference in the class. But the thing is, what if your students don't reveal a lot about themselves personally, or they're not willing to they're not racially diverse, they're not culturally very diverse? It happens sometimes. And then the thing to do then is to figure out ways of going outside beyond the classroom, even when you're in that class. So I have my students do some things on Twitter. Now, how deeply you can engage will depend on what kind of course you have and how much time you can give into it. There's a program called Solia, which I volunteered with, I facilitated, I coached facilitators, and it's pretty simple to sort of integrate it into your class if you're interested. And that's one of the things I'll put in the show notes as well. What they do is that they bring a group of 8 students, 4 of them from Western countries and then from Arab Muslim countries, and they bring them into dialogue it's intercultural dialogue about that relationship between East and West, or Arab Muslim West America. And they problematize all of that. They have facilitators from both sides of the world to sort of balance that out, and they recognize that there are power differences in that context. They recognize that there's differences in technology and infrastructure between the people from both sides. So if there are people in rural areas of the Arab world, their internet connections are going to be weaker. They recognize that the use of English is always going to privilege some people over others, but they still try to bring that explicitly and talk about it and bring students and help them over a period of several weeks, understand their own biases and understand the other slowly. And this can be integrated into any course. And I'm mentioning this specifically because this is something that other people, if they're interested in, they could go ahead and contact Solia and try to have in their own courses. If it fits their learning outcomes, you could do it with a political science or international relations course, but you could do it with a mass comm journalism type of course because they discuss media. You can do all kinds of things with this. So I just want to share something else, which is culturally relevant pedagogy. I'm not sure if this is a familiar term to a lot of people, and I'll share again some resources at the end of the podcast. But it's all about how do you ensure that whatever group of students you have in the class, that what you do in the class is culturally relevant to them. And it's usually comes from race theory and that kind of thing. But also it applies a lot to intercultural learning too. Because if you're in a classroom and there is diversity in the classroom, then just simply by addressing all the different cultures in the classroom, in your readings, in your pedagogy, in your choice of topics, rather than having them all, Eurocentric or white Western-centric type of thing. How aware people are of how diverse their syllabi are? Are all your students finding themselves as possible scholars in that field if they choose to be? And this is what I was remembering by Anne-Marie Perez just before we were talking, is that she was talking about the experience of being the only lonely, or something like that, in a conference, where being the only person of a certain culture or color in a certain location, how that makes you feel. You don't want your students to feel that way, right? So you don't want your students in your classroom to feel like they're studying chemistry, even if it's chemistry, right? So this is pretty not a very cultural type of thing, right? But I always feel like if we're studying chemistry in an Egyptian classroom, and everything we talk about in chemistry comes from the West, and we never mention any Arab or Muslim or Egyptian contribution to the field at all, that makes the students feel alienated from that field in some ways, If we discuss biology and we discuss issues of things like stem cell research, which isn't really done over here, and we don't discuss things like organ transplants, which is a big ethical issue here. You know what I mean? It's just like how you choose all of the content and the authors and everything that you choose in your class, and the way to do this culturally relevant pedagogy, if you yourself are very culturally different from your students, I think, is to ask the students, ask the parents, ask other faculty in your institution who are of different cultures to help you.
Yeah.
Don't assume that you on your own, you're not. No matter who you are, no matter how many different cultures you belong to, those are the only cultures you belong to, right? If someone is, American and they're married to an Indian, sure, they know about these two cultures, but they don't know anything about Swedish culture. They don't know anything about Mexican culture,
Yeah.
And your material is just going to keep getting richer if you just keep adding, opening yourself to allowing all of that to come in, I think. And everyone, I think, benefits in some way. It's not easy. It's hard. And it might be difficult for you as the teacher to incorporate because it's going to be unfamiliar stuff. And it might feel like it's irrelevant, but I really think it makes a big difference to students. Like when I teach educational game design and I make sure that my students read stuff by Egyptian people who write about educational game design, and I make sure that they find Arab-created games, that really makes a difference to them because it makes them feel, maybe someday I could be a game designer, even though we don't have the major. It's just one part of one course that I teach, but it's just sort of bring that a bit closer, which is, I think, moving a little bit away from intercultural learning, but it's also, I think, important.
You and I knew that we would. Before we even pressed record, we honed in, but we knew that we would get off track in the best ways possible. This is the time in the show where we normally each get to share recommendations, but since I shared with you that I hadn't come up with what mine was going to be yet, you volunteered to take my recommendation segment, and so you're going to give us a double hitter. The floor is yours.
Yes. So one is something that we've been talking about. I fell in love with this professor, I guess she's an assistant professor, called Rua Benjamin at Princeton, who gave the keynote at the ISTE conference this year. And she's phenomenal. And in that 1 hour keynote, she talks about maybe 20 really, really, really strong points. And she's a great presenter. And one of the things that really stood out for me was how she talks about discriminatory design. She's got a TED Talk about that as well. But I like her hour-long keynote a lot more. And it made me think a lot. And everyone, I think, who's listened to it has been really, really, affected by it. I think I've listened to it like 2 or 3 times now. And I pause and it makes me think. So it's definitely worth thinking about and listening to. And you'll really thank me for this one. There's also a blog post by Sherry Spelitz, Incuriosity, it's called. Or I think it's called There's a Thing, or Incuriosity is a Thing. And it's relevant to what we were talking about today about intercultural learning and, whether we're sort of raised not to be curious about things, just to let them be, and how that affects our interaction with each other. And that's worth reading. And then the third thing I wanted to recommend is Solia, which is this program I've been talking about. Now, there's a lot of kinds of intercultural exchange programs, but I know, for example, that it's quite difficult for students to you can't have every single student do an exchange program. And so this thing is a, low risk, low cost way to start building intercultural maturity that will, I think, help a lot of people if they later travel somewhere else. But even if they never do, they can build relationships with people from different parts of the world and just start doing something about it and, make use of the internet that we've already got. And then the very last thing is just, I would recommend reading about culturally relevant pedagogy, and I'll provide resources on that as well as about models of intercultural maturity.
You are so generous with your time, both for this podcast community, but also to me personally. I just treasure when we get a chance to go back and forth, and you continue to challenge me and challenge others in such a positive and encouraging ways. It's interesting thinking of you as a teacher that you challenge your students, and I consider myself one of them, and say, you can do better. But yet you're also encouraging us all the way along and giving us resources and support to continue our own development. So thank you so much for today and for always.
And you do this for a lot of us too, Bonnie. So thank you for your I love having these conversations with you, and I learn a lot by just being with you. So thank you.
Thanks to all of you for listening to today's conversation. As always, if you have feedback on the show, get potential guests or topics, you can do that at teachinginhighered.com/feedback. And if you have yet to subscribe to the weekly email, that'll come into your inbox, and it'll give you the show notes of all of the great resources, especially this week. It's going to be packed. It's going to be a packed set of show notes you're definitely going to want to get, and also an article about teaching or productivity written by me. You can subscribe at teachinginhighered.com/subscribe. And I so appreciate all the conversation that's happening in the Teaching in Higher Ed Slack channel. And if any of you are on Slack or want to try it out, it's a great place just to have a little bit of more privacy for asking questions that you don't want in a public space. And it's a great community. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.